Steve, thank you so much again for joining us here today. Maybe we can start off with, how did you become interested in the intersection of innovation and government?
Sure. So I'll go back to, as Paul said, I became a venture capitalist in 1999, which for those of you who research ancient history in the venture community, that was the tail end of one of the biggest bubbles in the industry. So the internet bubble in the 90s was a great time for venture capitalists to make money, to raise large funds, and to hire new people. So it was a very easy time to get a job, and that's how I was able to break into the business, was to get a job. But the problem with getting a job at the end of a bubble is, as a venture capitalist, there's a long lag time between the investments that you make and when they come to fruition. And so it was really hard to keep your job if you got a job in 1999 in the venture capital industry. I was fortunate enough to be able to do that because the industry crashed in 2001, and all the initial investments I did sort of looked pretty bad at that point. So I went back to my roots, which is I grew up in Washington, D.C. with my dad working for the U.S. government. And so I thought to myself, hey, the U.S. government spends a lot of money on technology products and services. I never see them as an interesting vertical market for any of the startup companies I look at. If I could help figure out how to help these companies sell into the U.S. government, that could help differentiate me as an investor in a much more difficult time in this industry to differentiate yourself and be successful. So I surveyed some of the CEOs in my portfolio. One of them, Chris Darby, raised his hand and said, yep, I'd like to figure out how to sell the U.S. government. And so Chris and I went to D.C. a couple of times and met with people and tried to help his company, Sarvega, sell products into the U.S. government. Along the way, we met In-Q-Tel, which was really getting off the ground at that point. And In-Q-Tel was going to invest in Sarvega, the company Chris was running, when we sold it to Intel Corporation. And about a year later, In-Q-Tel called us up. They were looking for a new CEO in DC, and they were interested in talking to Chris about that, but they were also looking for a managing general partner in Menlo Park, and they were interested in talking to me about that. So that's how I made the move. And to me, at the end of 2006, when I took that job, it was an opportunity to bring both parts of my life together. Part of life growing up in DC with not just my dad, but a lot of my friends' parents working for the government. And then the part of my life since 1992 being out here in Silicon Valley, working with startup companies in some form or another.
Go ahead. You know, I teach with Steve Blank, and one of his many great lines is, what do you call a failed entrepreneur? And he says, experienced. So, you know, you've had your challenges in early days. You had a failed startup, I think, in '94, but then you had some success. Can you describe some of your earlier struggles and what you learned and how you overcame them?
Sure. So I like to joke, I worked for 3 startup companies, and one went out of business, one got bought, and one went public. So that's the whole spectrum, right? Only one of those 3 things can happen, and it happened in that order. So hopefully I got better at picking which startup companies to go to. But you know, when I graduated from the GSB, I know there's some GSB students in the audience, but when I graduated in GSB in 1994, the startup community and the, you know, sort of the whole vibe of like going to work for a startup company, it wasn't really there. You know, everyone went to investment banking or consulting or firms like, you know, Procter & Gamble or 3M or places like that. And it was kind of unheard of, or not unheard of, but there were maybe 10 of us that graduated without a job and said we wanted to go work for a startup company, and we'd figure that out. So it was much more unusual back then. And the first startup company I went to had a great idea that, you know, I'm sure many of you will resonate with, which is we built a modem that plugged into a Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo machines to allow you to play video games over the phone lines against people in other homes. It was the first time someone could play a video game against someone who wasn't sitting next to you on the couch. So great idea, billion-dollar idea, but we were too early. And even ultimately, that company went out of business. And after being there for 2 years, and what happens when a startup company goes out of business is you get laid off. So all of a sudden there I was, having gone to this school that you guys don't like me to talk about, back east, and my parents had scrimped and saved on a government employee salary, you know, in order to pay for my tuition there. And I had saved a lot of money working after college to pay for Stanford Business School, which, you know, was not cheap then, I'm sure it's not cheap now. And all of a sudden I found myself walking into the San Mateo County unemployment office and getting an unemployment check. And that was kind of a grim moment for me, because, you know, you start to think like, geez, I thought I was kind of hot shit. I went to Harvard and Stanford business school, and here I am without a job and, you know, no money to pay my rent unless I get this unemployment check. And that was kind of a dark day for me, and it is sort of you know, almost a rite of passage now, you know, to go through a failure. But back then, you know, wasn't really what I was expecting there. And I made it through in part because of the group of GSB classmates I had that all decided to go through startup companies and decided, hey, we would support each other, and it did become sort of a badge of honor after a while. And the next company I went to didn't care, and they employed me, and like I said, that got bought, and so we made a little money on that. And then the next one was E-Trade, and that went public, and I made a little money on that. So now it sounds like a great story, right? But back then it was definitely, when I think of sort of the down moments in my life, walking into that unemployment office was definitely one of them.
Mm-hmm. It feels like every person in Silicon Valley who's successful also has that story of the one that got away.
Right.
What was that for you?
So when I was there, in between that first and second startup company, dealing with sort of what my life was at, my college roommate, who had started out on the venture capital side and then decided he wanted to start a company, asked me to be his co-founder. And I just wasn't ready to take that risk again of doing a startup, and we were probably looking at it sort of a year without salary, and I just couldn't pull that off. So I passed on the startup company. That company became a company called Kwan Communications. It was the first company to use email as a medium to provide customer service and support. So all these companies were all of a sudden getting email, because email just emerged in 1994 and 95 as a medium, and they didn't know what to do with that, how to provide customer service to customers that were emailing them. And so he built the application that did it. Went public, he made tens of millions of dollars, off of that, and so that's probably the one that got away for me. But everything all works out in the end. So I tell lots of people, because the venture capital business, you miss deals, and I love to tell young venture capitalists that work for me, it's not about the deals you don't do. Don't worry about that. Everyone's going to miss the deal. It's about the deals you do. Just make sure some number of the deals you do are good, and everything will be fine. And don't worry about the ones you miss. So.
See, maybe a little more on how you got into venture capital. You had some interesting experiences, but you lived at ground zero there in Menlo at the base of Sand Hill. But how'd you get into it?
So summer of 1993, I'm at Stanford Business School. I'd worked for a government consulting firm in between undergrad and business school, and come out to California. I thought I was going to be a 2-year California vacation. I upgraded for weather from my undergraduate place, and was having a great time. But I decided I would try the startup world out, and so I interned for a startup company in the glamorous world of network management software, a company called Net Labs. And they had venture capitalists on the board from Menlo Ventures, IVP, and Mayfield, and those two firms later merged to become Redpoint. And so I reported to the venture capitalists on sort of the summer project that I did, and I got to see what they did as a job, and I thought that was pretty cool. So I met with each of those in my second year of business school and said, hey, I kind of like what you did. How do I become a venture capitalist? And they said, look, Steve, you're kind of a smart, hardworking, good guy, but there's a lot of smart, hardworking people that want to get in the venture business. Why don't you go out and get operating experience in an area you think will be interested in investing 5 years from now, because that's the best way to get a job in the venture industry. And so in spring of my second year of business school, Mosaic, the first internet browser, came out, and people started to discover the idea of this thing called the internet. And so basically I decided to bet my 5 years, if you will, of getting experience in the internet, figuring that it would be the hot area that people would want to be investing in when I'd be sort of experienced enough and qualified enough to get a job in the venture business. The short story is that's what I did. Obviously, stories are never quite as neat and easy as that sounds, but it's still, I think, a good rule of thumb and a good sense of, if you are interested in getting into venture, go out and get operating experience in an area you think they'll be investing in 5 years from now. It also helps you when you are a venture capitalist working with entrepreneurs. If you talk about, hey, I've been there trying to get the first customer for a company. I've been there trying to make payroll, and not having cash for 4 weeks. I've been there when we've had to lay people off. I've been there when we've had to figure out how to scale because all of a sudden our business is taking off. It gives you a lot of relevance to the entrepreneur as a board member that not all venture capitalists have if they've only worked in investment banking or consulting and as a VC. Mm-hmm.
So you've been with In-Q-Tel for several years now. Maybe we can start talking a little bit more about In-Q-Tel. What exactly is In-Q-Tel?
Sure. So In-Q-Tel is actually an independent not-for-profit. So we're a 501c3, and we were created by CIA in 1999 to bridge the gap between the innovation occurring in the then 10,000 plus venture-backed startup companies in the United States and the technical challenges facing CIA at the time. What they wanted and what they had in their relationships with large corporate R&D groups like Xerox, PARC, and Bell Labs was to both influence product direction and try new technology as it matured. And they realized that innovation had shifted in the United States from those large corporate R&D labs to these startup companies, and they didn't have the ability either to influence product direction or try it as it was emerging. And so they created In-Q-Tel to sort of bridge that gap, as I said. We figured out the best way to do that was to act as an investor first and foremost, because acting as an investor sort of gives you entrance into the club. And you start to hang out with people from General Catalyst and other firms like that, and they treat you as a peer, and they are much more, quite frankly, intellectually honest with you about what the company is and what the technology does than if they perceive you to be just a vendor. Similarly with the entrepreneurs. Secondly, though, we've had to figure out a way to influence product direction and purchase the product so that the government employees could try it, because what companies want is they want purchase orders. And they get funded, as I think most of you know or are learning, in sort of 12 to 24-month timeframes. And so in order for them to raise their next round of funding, they have to demonstrate tangible progress to their investors. The best way to demonstrate tangible progress is purchase orders. And the government traditionally did make a purchase order decision in less than 12 months. In fact, it typically takes 24, 36, 48 months. And so that's why startup companies traditionally ignored the government. So we created this mechanism that's called a work program. It's a contract between In-Q-Tel and the company. We invest to create that equity relationship. We get an observer seat to the board of trustees. We give companies some amount of NRE dollars, non-recurring engineering dollars, to influence the product direction. And then we purchase enough product to do a pilot. In-Q-Tel is the customer, we sign the PO, but we have the right to deploy a pilot at CIA, NSA, one of the other agencies, because we've grown over time to where we now work with 9 different government agencies. If that pilot goes well, we then work with the procurement people such that they then procure directly from the portfolio companies more stuff, more licenses, more gadget, whatever they sell. And we call that adoption when that happens. As a 501c3 not-for-profit, we measure ourselves first and foremost the number of pilots we generate and the number of adoptions we generate, as well as the qualitative impact score that we get from them about how important those pilots or adoptions were. Any proceeds we generate from our investing just get reinvested into our model, so that now today we provide somewhere between 35 to 40% of our funding from proceeds we've generated from previous transactions, and 60 to 65% of our funding comes from the agencies that we work with. So it's a discount to the taxpayer in terms of what we do. Mm-hmm. Over time, we've evolved, as I said, to where we now work with CIA, NSA, NRO, NGA, DIA, Customs and Border Patrol, FBI, ONR, Office of Naval Research, CENTCOM, and DHS. And then we also have an international fund that we get money from CIA, the Brits, and the Aussies to invest international. And we also now invest, this is the most recent thing that has changed for us, as the primary mission of the defense and intelligence community has shifted from global war on terrorism to nation-state competition with China and Russia. They've realized that commercial technology is an important strategic lever in that competition. And so CIA and others are looking at us and sort of say, so what's China doing with Huawei? How are they using Beijing genomics to project power and influence geopolitical events around the world? What about TikTok? And so we're now investing not just to deliver capabilities, but we're also realizing that by sitting on the boards of 150 companies around the world at the cutting edge of emerging technology, we have a unique perspective on what China is doing, how they're trying to influence standards bodies out there, how they're trying to subsidize certain technologies to be adopted by Africa and South America in particular. And so we're providing insights back to our customers about that. So I like to say yesterday we invested just to deliver capabilities. Today we invest to deliver capabilities and insights as well. Mm-hmm.
Steve, government-facing companies face a lot of challenges. Startups, right. Palantir, Anduril. And a lot of people like to point out, for those 2 companies, what do they have in common? They got, billionaire co-founders, but they also got help from In-Q-Tel. Yeah. In-Q-Tel is famously helpful with Palantir, but what's In-Q-Tel's role in those government-facing companies like Anduril, Palantir, others?
Look, I think we help in a lot of different ways, but our fundamental value proposition is we got both Palantir and Anduril, their first government customer. We're through that work program mechanism that I just described. And that's so important to startup companies when they're first getting started, is how do I get that first customer? How do I make that customer successful and referenceable so other customers will buy? So Palantir, we got involved early. I think we were one of the first investors outside the Peter Thiel collection of funds that invested in them. And we walked them into CIA, DIA, NGA, 3 different government agencies. And we ultimately got pilots from them, and those pilots led to adoptions, as I talked about. So when Trey Stevens, who was here, I think a couple weeks ago, talking to you guys, had the idea at Founders Fund to start Anduril, he came down and talked to us and said, this was even before they incorporated the company, and so I said, we're starting another company here. I'm sure he gave you his little shtick here. I think it's great. At the time, 2 of the 5 highest valued private companies in the world were Palantir and SpaceX. But number 3 on that list of private companies that were selling to the government was like number 2,500 in terms of value. And so he was like, I want to start the next Palantir and SpaceX. And it was Anduril, and I want In-Q-Tel to be involved from the very beginning here and run the same playbook that we ran with Palantir to get us to the first customer. We did with Anduril at CBP. So that's really our sweet spot of what I think is bringing value, is getting that first customer contract, because it's such a leap for the government to contract with a startup company that has no government business, and it's these startups that are focusing on government need some sort of market validation, as Paul alluded to in his opening comments here, for their investors that what they're doing makes sense. And so an investment, a work program from In-Q-Tel gives them that validation. We get them to their first customer quicker than they otherwise would have. Hopefully, we throw a lot of bodies at that pilot to make it as successful as possible. And then once it's successful and they get that adoption, then the company's sort of more on its own to go out and sell to other government customers, as both Palantir and Anduril and a number of our other companies in our portfolio have done.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, there's also a number of more, call it dual-use companies that In-Q-Tel has supported, invested in, and helped get off the ground. I'm thinking specifically like MongoDB, Cloudera, FireEye, Databricks. Maybe can you share a little bit more about what was In-Q-Tel's role in at least one of those companies?
Sure, that's really actually our sweet spot. There aren't that many, although it's increasing every day. There aren't that many startup companies that are venture-backed that are government-first companies. Palantir, back when it was the first company, Joe will remember, there are a lot of venture capitalists that just wouldn't look at Palantir because it was selling to the government. They're like, we don't understand how to sell to the government. And you look at that first set of investors Palantir got, it was not the traditional VC community. Fast forward 10 years when Trey started Anduril, he was able to get brand name tier 1 firms like General Catalyst to come and invest because they were more comfortable with it. But the bread and butter of what we do is actually dual-use technology. So these are typically companies that have started out to build products to serve commercial customers and have concluded either that the government's too difficult a market for them to go after, or they aren't even aware that there is a market within the government for their technologies. And so we're pretty good at identifying those companies, going in and de-frictionizing the process for them to think about, hey, you know what, if I do a work program with In-Q-Tel, get a couple of customers, I can build a federal sales vertical, and when some of these companies went public that you talked about, FireEye, Mongo, Cloudera, eventually, I think we all expect Databricks to go public. Those companies had a vertical, public sector vertical market that was generating 20-25% of their revenues. That's meaningful to a private company, and they probably need us more than Anduril needed us, right? By the time Trey started Anduril, he knew a lot of things about how to sell to the government, and some of those other government first companies are the same way. But the companies that we just listed, they really knew a lot less about selling to the government. They had to be convinced, their investors and board members had to be convinced that, hey, it's worth our time and energy to do that. But if you want to do big data analytics, right, you want to use companies like Databricks and things like that. If you want to do great cyber stuff, you want to use FireEye and other things like that. It's great for the government agencies to access those technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to shamelessly plug a course called Hacking for Defense here if you're a Stanford student want to take it. But we adopted Steve Blank's business model canvas to what we call mission model canvas. So because there's differences when you're dealing with the government, the DoD or any government agency. Success is measured in not in revenue like the commercial sector, but in impact and mission achievement. And importantly, the person buying the product isn't the person using it. I mean, it's just different working with the government. How does In-Q-Tel approach the government as a customer?
Right. So I like to say, the person who cares about your product sits here. The person who has budget sits here. The person who has authority sits here, right? So in order to get a deal done with a government agent, you have to do this sort of weird triangulation that it is much more complex and less straightforward than when you're trying to sell to Morgan Stanley or Walmart or you pick the brand name commercial company. The way we work with these agencies is when we ask them, or they decide they want to work with us, they have to do three things. First is they have to give us money, right? We need money to invest. Second thing they have to do is give us a problem set. This is a list of what problems they want us to make investments against. That, to us, is just a starting point in the conversation with them about what they really want. Because oftentimes they'll say, we want X, then we'll bring them a company that does X, and they'll say, now that I see it live and can touch it and feel it, I realize I need X plus Y. So we'll go back and find a company that does X plus Y. So it's an iterative process to figure out what they want. And then the third thing we do is we ask them to create an interface center. And the government being the government, they create an acronym along with that interface center called the In-Q-Tel Interface Center, which became the QUIC, QIC. And these are full-time government employees whose job it is to represent the problem set back to us. And when we bring companies in, identify the end users that want to participate in the work program. But then once we do the pilot, they're also identifying how we're going to do procurement. So there's procurement expertise in the interface as well. And like I said, we're doing all this work to de-frictionize the process, to set up the procurement process such that if the end user says, thumbs up, I like what this pilot does, they're ready to contract directly with the portfolio company. And that's what you have to do in the government is you have to find an end user who's a champion. You have to find and identify a place in the government that has the budget. And these budgets are committed 1, 2, 3 years out, as you know. So you have to figure out how am I going to get this funded in the meantime before the budget frees up. And then you have to figure out what is the contract vehicle, the purchasing authority that you're going to use to tie this all together to get a deal done. So it is complex. We have built like a lot of venture firms, we built a sort of set of resources around the investing efforts that we do to help our companies. We call it the Government Platform Accelerator, GPA. And so we then have resources available to our entrepreneurs that we invest in to sort of say, hey, all right, now you got your pilot customer, you're thinking about, hey, how do I build a federal sales team? Who do I interview? How do I find them? How do I evaluate them? How do I count them? These are things that the big primes know like the back of their hand. But if you're a startup entrepreneur who's only worked at Google or Facebook or Cisco or Intel, you've never really done this before. We have resources to help you, think about that, figure that out. And so we try and educate our companies so that when they have success, they're ready to take advantage of that and build an even bigger business and deliver more impact to our government agencies.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the problem sets and sectors you're focused on right now?
Yeah, so big data analytics has been a sort of very active theme for us for a long time. That today is about AI, and generative AI is certainly becoming more and more a part of it. Cybersecurity has been another consistent area for us to invest in. But what people don't realize is about 45% of the investing we do is actually in hardware. So we're actually one of the more prolific hardware investors out there. So we invest in microelectronics companies. We got a co-investment with Paul at General Catalyst. It's a complete moonshot deal to disrupt the microelectronics manufacturing world and help reset it in a way that's more favorable to the U.S. interest than it currently is today. We did, to Joe's point, we made our first commercial satellite investment in a company that was a spin out of Stanford. It was a group of students out of Stanford called Skybox. And I think we probably made that investment in 2009. So well before commercial satellites were sort of a real thing. In fact, I remember showing it to this guy that was, Air Force and NRO and CIA, and he was the point person for the community at that time and working with SpaceX, and we showed him this, group of Stanford students that wanted to build a miniature, smaller than a cube-size satellite, and he walks out of the meeting and just goes, oh, I remember when I was young and naive and didn't know what I didn't know, and we were like, no, you were missing this. This is how these companies get built. And 6 years later, Google bought them for a healthy sum of money. So, and we had, the intelligence community finally, start figuring out that, hey, just because we build these exquisite classified satellites in the sky doesn't mean we can't leverage a lot of commercial technology for other use cases. I'm running on a little bit here, but I just want to hit one last point on this. If you've paid attention to the conflict in Ukraine, first of all, we're very proud that we have over 30 portfolio companies contributing technology to that effort. But one of the first ways we contributed, our portfolio contributed value, was before the conflict even started. For the first time, the U.S. intelligence community and the State Department and the Foreign Service community in general started to share intelligence publicly, sort of saying, Russia's saying they're not going to invade, but we can show you their troops are here, they're pre-positioning people over here. We shared information collected by satellites with allies and with the public, and we did so because it had been collected by commercial satellite companies. And previously, the intelligence community never wanted to share intelligence because then you had to, it would expose classified mechanisms and means that it might have been collected by, and it was a lot easier to share commercial technology. So it is a real impact story for us. One of the things we're most proud of is the way we've helped the community really adopt commercial satellite as an important mechanism in collection.
So see, this is a class called Silicon Valley in the government. So this is a self-select group of students who have an interest in working at the intersection of government and innovation. You mentioned that national security challenges are shifting, terrorism to great power competition. What are the opportunities now for these students here to get involved at the intersection of government and innovation?
Oh, I think there's lots of opportunities. The U.S. government, the Intelligence and Defense Committee, think of it as like a big tanker, right? It's really hard to turn, but once you start to turn it, it's sort of inevitable that it's keep turning. And so that's where we are, I think, in this space. For a long time, the government didn't want to abandon or stop relying on its core set of primes, and it wanted to keep just working with those same set of companies. But they finally figured out that for certain areas of technology, they're still world-class partners for, but other sets of technology, they're not, and they're never going to get there. If you want to be world-class at autonomy, if you want to be world-class at AI, if you want to be world-class at cyber, if you want to be world-class at sensor platforms and collection, you have to engage in the commercial startup world in order to get the best and brightest. What the commercial tech and the Fortune 100 figured out, quite frankly, in the 2010 timeframe, it took the government until now to figure it out, but they figured it out now, and they're inevitably shifting an increasing percentage of spend each year to that through things like In-Q-Tel and DIU and AFWorks and OSC, Office of Strategic Capital, as well as landing program of records for companies like SpaceX and Anduril. And so this shift is happening, and so people like you, Stanford students, who can sit at the intersection of technology. Stanford's a great technology university, but it's also a great business university. It's a great international relations and program as well. People who can sit here and talk to your fellow classmates and peers and understand, oh, you're technical, I'm IR, you're business, what can I learn from you? You're going to become more valuable to companies that want to sell into this community. If you want to work for government agencies, you're going to be more valuable as a government person, because no one like 20 years older than you has any more experience than you have in this space. And in fact, you're probably younger and more open to new ideas than they are. And so I think it's a great opportunity to go into either government as an IR person, business as a startup person, or as a technologist, go into either work for the government or for startup world. So I think it's a great time. It's rare that an industry this big goes through such a disruptive change as what we're going through right now. And as a venture capitalist, one of the things you learn to do is studying patterns. When a big market goes through disruption, there's a lot of opportunity for new people, new entrepreneurs, new entrants to come in and build successful careers doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
And Steve, there's so many individuals in the room who are either starting companies or looking to start companies. What's advice that you would give to founders in the room?
So Joe referenced what do you guys call it, lean startup?
Yeah, sure.
Right. I'm a big believer in that philosophy, whether you call it that or, there's a guy previously called it MVP, minimally viable product process. But the common mistake I think entrepreneurs make sometimes is they think they know what the market wants and they just start to build it right away. And instead, take a step back, and before you build anything, go out and talk to any number of people that could be customers, could be end users, could be partners for you, and really figure out and understand more precisely and more intimately, what problem it is that you're trying to solve, and what is the set of product features that is needed to solve that. And then once you figure that out and you feel like you're hearing the same answer over and over again from enough people as you do this sort of exploration product, then that's what you build. And so I would really encourage you guys, hacking for defense is great. There's like 2 other hacking classes, right? For climate change and for something else there. I'd go out and do those classes, learn that process. It will serve you, for the rest of your life. In this world, and I think if you that's my first piece of advice would be go do that.
I think we got some people. Who's my fall class? You guys are. You're gonna learn all about lean here. So great advice for startup founders. What about folks who want to get into venture capital, Steve?
Yeah, so venture capital is a more mature industry now than 1994 when I was your guys' age, or maybe even still a little older than you guys are. And now we won't go back any farther. But when I was getting in, so back when I was trying to get in, venture firms were small and they were kind of flat. They were just partners. And again, one of the myths in the venture capital industry back then was, hey, if I'm not doing the due diligence myself, I'm not a good, investor. And so there wasn't this idea of like, we're going to have associates, and there's going to be principals, and there's going to be partners, then there's going to be senior partners. The pyramid approach that is more reflective of today's industry. And so you couldn't get a job out of undergrad. That was unheard of. You could barely get a job in venture out of business school. You had to go get operating experience as the advice was given to me, and I went and did. And I think it's still a great advice. But the venture industry is also interesting in that a lot of different paths to success, right? Some of the most successful venture capitalists in the world have been journalists before that. It's not something you would necessarily think like would be the way to do it. Some only worked at investment banks, some only worked at consulting firms. So there are lots of different ways to do it. But again, I think at the end of the day, as a venture capitalist, you're asked to evaluate team, you're asked to evaluate technology, and you're asked to evaluate markets, and then you're asked to build relationships and network and source. So I would go out and do something to try and build one of those 5 skills. Can I do something that develops my analytical brain? Can I do something that will help me build my network of people that might be interesting people to start companies or help place into interesting startups down the road? Can I develop my technical curiosity and wisdom so that I can help evaluate things? Can I get experience selling the first customer? The hardest thing to do as a startup company is land that first customer. If you get any experience at all, that's all. I didn't know that. I stumbled into that at the startup companies I was at. But having that scar tissue to be able to go in and sort of say, look, I got the first 10 customers for this company. I got the first 5 customers for this company. Even though it was a consumer company, I did our first 10 partnerships with game companies at the startup that fail. If you can go do that in some form or another, that makes you incredibly relevant and valuable to this ecosystem. And just you can't underestimate enough the network effect. When I did come out here for Stanford Business School in 1992, I came out a couple weeks early to get my place, line up my roommates, and one of the things I started doing was playing pickup basketball at Robley, right around the corner here, before school started. And one day, it was a Friday noon game, a friend of mine, who's going to be a classmate, and I were playing, and afterwards, these 2 guys that we've been playing with sort of sat outside with us and asked us what we were doing today when we were about to start GSB, and they said, well, we actually just graduated from the GSB ourselves a couple years ago, and we still sneak out from our jobs on Fridays to play basketball. So we said, that sounds pretty good to us. What advice do you, what do you give us? And they said 2 things, and I still think it was actually the most significant 2 things I learned in my 2 years of business school. So I could have saved all that tuition and just played basketball all the time. But the first thing was, don't be competitive with your classmates. A rising tide floats all ships. And your classmates from Stanford, whether it's undergrad or any one of the graduate schools that might be represented here, are going to be successful in life. And that's going to be an asset to you as you build your career, the fact that you have relationships with people that are being successful. So, if you're going through that trade-off, like, do I want to study a little bit more, or do I want to go build a deeper relationships with one or more of my classmates? I would say skip the studying and go hang out with your classmates, because that will actually really help you in life and be actually more rewarding than getting an A instead of an A minus in a class. And the second thing they said was, nobody ever pays you not to have an opinion. So one of the challenges that people that are really smart, like all of you, and go to really smart schools like this, is you want to find the right, perfect answer to every question. And you get in the business world, and that's not nearly the case of what the real life's all about. It's sloppy, it's messy, it's dirty. You never have all the data you need. You can never know for certain what the right answer is. And you have to be comfortable having an opinion and making a recommendation on imperfect information that is some combination of analysis, but also gut. And if you don't get comfortable with that, you're never going to be valuable to whatever organization that you're a part of.
Good advice. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your time, your insights, and just more about your work at In-Q-Tel.
Great. Thank you, everybody.